I would like to introduce to you Franny Lee, who is Associate Director of the Stanford Intellectual Property Exchange, which is one of the programs of Codex, which is the Center for Legal Informatics, a collaboration between the law school and the computer science department. Now, Franny comes to this interest in a very interesting way. As an attorney who has practiced intellectual property law with all kinds of media, including litigation as well as advising capacities. She came to Stanford about a year and a half ago as a fellow and has been a major force in moving the Stanford Intellectual Property Exchange forward. So I'm very pleased to introduce Franny to you and let you hear about some of the interesting things that CIFIX is doing.
Thank you. I did want to take a moment to say thank you to the rest of the Media X for inviting me to give this talk and organizing it. We appreciate the opportunity to share some of the exciting work we're doing and really appreciate the opportunity to canvass a larger demographic for more interdisciplinary views on this type of research. I'd like to take a quick survey on that note about who's in the audience right now. In the divide between industry and academia, who hears from a business or industry representative? And the rest are academia or interest in academia?
Hybrid, some of us.
That works as well. We like to hear views from business school, the economics department, technical, computer science, engineering viewpoints. We found that all of these are necessary for us to do our research properly. So, I love hearing from all points of scope. This talk is going to discuss how bringing IP clarity, specifically copyright clarity, can change the way that content, that users interact with content. And I'll give a 30-second preamble just to give you an idea of where I come from on copyright issues. I began my career as a musician, found out quickly that I either didn't have the stomach or the talent to be a long-term career musician and moved to music and copyright law. But I do like to think of this change in career as a way for me to help develop the copyright system to help music and help creators. My general views on copyright are that, and I'm a big fan of its fundamental principles. It is an incentive system, and it's meant to encourage creativity by helping creators create music or art or literature and to share those creations with society to help develop culture and education and communication. The incentives can be financial incentives. Copyright creates a limited time period monopoly for the creator so they can seek economic return on their work if they choose, or it can be other incentives, such as making sure that the creator gets credit and attribution for their work. For those in the academic community, peer review, citations in other people's articles, that type of recognition is quite important and has enormous value, even if there's no monetary return. But I do feel right now that our copyright systems are out of balance and need to be recalculated. I won't go into the reasons for why it's out of balance because that could fill up in another 3-hour session. But I would say that there are too many creators right now that have problems getting paid and have problems getting credit attached to their works these days, and there are too many users that don't know what they can do with things with creations that they find. So in this sense, copyright systems can improve through law by legislating a statutory regime or by creating new precedents in court actions that give guidelines for other people to follow. But what has particularly interested me is how technology can perhaps have the quickest and most significant impact of all. And to that end, we start talking about civics. So the roadmap for the next hour or so is, well, less than an hour, I'll give a quick overview of what Codex does, then a quick overview of what CIPEX is, the Stanford Intellectual Property Exchange, what its objectives are, and a description of how the technology and the system work. I want to introduce what the current practices in educational content are for copyright clearance, and then give a description of how CIPEX's system works in contrast to that by describing how we've deployed this technology so far. Talk about some of the observations we've made from these deployments, and then we get into more of an analytical conversation about what the impacts are of this technology and what the further impacts might be on the content community in general, whether or not this could have a bigger effect than just on how professors and students interact with content, but how people view and value and price copyrights in general. Codex, Martha mentioned, is an interdisciplinary research center situated between the computer science department and the law school. Our mission statement is to create technology and use information technology to help law be more efficient and more accessible to all stakeholders. So in other words, to create technologies that help the practice or the ability to use law better. Our research teams are quite diverse. There are several projects that are hosted under Codex, and research teams can include faculty, students, industry advisors, a wide array of different departments across campus and from industry as well. CIPEX is a technology that's been built by Codex, and it is a web-based platform with three main components. The first component is a copyright registry. So this is somewhere that content owners can go to input works they've created. They can fill in the bibliographic data that goes with those works, who is the author. They have an account that they can get paid to if someone decides to go and purchase their work as well. And they set their own prices, which leads into the second component of CIPEX, which is a marketplace exchange. So this is something similar to an eBay system or an Amazon system. If I've written a book and I want to be able to distribute that online, I can go to CIPEX, post it up, set my fee for what kind of use I'm willing to sell for, and then buyers can come onto the system and make those purchases. The third component of CIPEX is that we are a copyright clearance service for distribution platforms, and I'll break that out a little bit in the next slide. So the plain explanation for what the CIPEX copyright clearance service is that it will, through an API, it will tell the user who's requesting a certain article what they may already be allowed to do with that article. And then two, if the user needs to get more permissions in order to make the use they want to make, CIPEX helps facilitate that transaction as well. So how does it do this? We have, through the registry, we have information about who owns the product, how much they're willing to sell for, and we also connect with different databases that have online rights registered. So if I'm a user coming onto the system, I select the article I want to see, and the system will automatically tell me, is this public domain content? Public domain content would be free for everyone to use. It's no longer in copyright, therefore I can use it with no fee and my charge would be zero. Is this an article that I can use under a conditional license for no royalty? And these are things like Creative Commons, where the only condition may be you have to make sure that the author's name gets distributed with that particular article. Have I already bought a license to use this article? It will check within your CIPEX account to see if you already have an outstanding permission. It will also check to see if someone else has bought you permission to use that article. And what I mean by this is there are often subscription or beneficiary agreements. For example, in the school context, the library receives a certain budget from the tuition fees of the students to go out and buy subscriptions for journals and articles to create Stanford's research library. And under these subscription licenses, students and professors and Stanford affiliates are allowed to make certain uses of those particular articles and journals already. So if that's the case, and this particular user is coming into the system and is identified as belonging to that beneficiary group, then the license filter will recognize that and dynamically calculate accordingly. If there is no record in CIPIX that the rights I need are already in place, then CIPIX tells me the price and the conditions of use which have been registered by the content owner. We do this in a user-centric fashion, so particularly for subscription licenses, say a Harvard student comes in and wants to purchase the same article, they would not have the benefit of the Stanford subscription price. So in this case, we will dynamically calculate a price per user based on that user's attributes. So now that you have a little background on what CIPIX is, I think the motives for building CIPIX should be discussed as well. Our main objective is to bring clarity and a sort of do-it-yourself accessibility to copyright practices. So ideally, my vision for CIPIX would be your average Joe can come onto the system and be able to buy or sell a copyright or grant permission for a license for all types of content, for books, for music, for film, and that CIPIX can be used in all kinds of environments, not just academic and educational environments, but in commercial uses. For example, if a composer wants to wants to be able to license their composition out for a movie soundtrack. And to help bring, I'd like CIPIX to help bring this type of content to all types of media output as well. So that could be print, it could be digital, it could be mobile, and obviously these are very lofty goals. It's a long-term goal, and it's ongoing. We do make forays. Right now we are trying to develop our digital distributions, although the current system right now is enabled for academic content, literary works such as books and journals, for the Stanford community only, and our initial deployments have been for print-on-demand course materials. The reason these types of technologies are necessary is because copyright law is not well tuned to the average Joe. It's complicated, and it can involve an infinite number of different variables and different paths. Copyright situations can involve any kind of content, music, books, video. It can involve any kind of different activity, internet streaming, or photocopies from use in advertising or commercial settings to putting soundtracks in movies. And it can come, and the resulting situation is an endless number of possible conditions. If you want to set a certain jurisdiction for the use, that can be one possible provision. If you want to define only one certain type of user is allowed to make that use, that could be another restriction. So you end up with the scope of copyright covering anything your mind can create, doing anything a mind might want to do with that creation. So it becomes, to create a legal contract becomes quite difficult, and in most cases, it's too much legal noise for a non-user to tolerate. So a standardization or a simplification of this system is necessary. Extra complications that arise, and some of these are in large part due to the fact that technology to distribute content has far outpaced technology to track the original source of content. Extra complications that have arisen are things like orphan works. I like to think of orphan works as they have no mommy or daddy. So what I mean by this is they're lost because you need to go and ask the copyright owners for permission to use the work in most cases. But if you can't find anyone to ask, that work becomes lost and no one can do anything with it. Copyright is also very fractured. It's not a physical product. It's not like a teddy bear where you can buy and sell the whole thing in one transaction. Copyright is a bundle of many different rights, and each of those rights can be split apart and assigned a different owner. So you end up having very complex ownerships and fracture situations. And that's aggravated in part because the governments don't require mandatory registration for who these owners are. There is no centralized database to find out if transfers have taken place, and for this reason, it's the proliferation of orphan works and the difficulties in copyright licensing are quite prevalent. I think it's helpful to look at current copyright practices to see how some of these extra complications and obstacles, to see the effect of these extra complications and obstacles. So this is a very simplified flowchart of how a professor might photocopy an article for his class. So at the start, the professor or the TA, or perhaps it's a bookstore who wants to use that article in the professor's course reader materials, they can either go to the copyright owner initially, or directly, and try to identify them as the first step. And when I say identify, it could be a multi-level investigation to identify who the rights owner is, for reasons such as there is fracturing of rights and ownership. It could be the author who is the owner. It could be the publisher of that author who is the owner. It could be a subsequent owner if they've sold it. So often it involves a multi-level trace until you get a response from the right person who confirms that they are the owner. Once you identify who they are, you need to locate them, contact them, and request the permission for the activity you see. This is also a difficult step because often, particularly in situations where it involves a micropayment to the copyright owner, the copyright owner may not feel it's justified to spend the transaction costs necessary to complete that particular transaction, and the request goes ignored. So in this situation, again, if you don't have permission, generally you can't use the work, and that, although not technically an orphan work, becomes an orphan works type situation. If you do receive permission and a price, then you can move forward and have that particular piece of material used for the class. The other approach a professor, TA, or bookstore might take is to go to a copyright agency. And a copyright agency would have many copyright owners that it represents and be able to negotiate that particular request on their behalf. So in this situation, if the copyright agency does not represent that particular work or that particular owner, you'd have to go back to step one and contact.
Are you up for questions as you go along?
Sure. Shoot them out.
You know, the most likely scenario currently for here is the professor just Xeroxes the material and passes it out.
That's
right, so there's no cost. Now, if you do this system, is it going to make doing that much harder?
It's not going to make it much harder. I think this traditional system, this is actually the way to clear copyrights right now.
The legal way.
The legal way, right.
Legal way.
Well, when I say clear copyrights, I mean to get the permission that you may need to get. A lot of professors, my closing line here is assuming, of course, the professor is willing to go through this process and doesn't just use the material.
I mean, one of the reasons they don't use this, anything like this, is how do you make the micropayment? Who's going to pay for that? And so the professors just do it. And it seems to me that if we had a new procedure that would make that a very suspicious activity, it's going to really clamp down on that.
Stay tuned for the next slide. So, again, this process here would be your current traditional method for copyright clearance. Of course, professors do sidestep that sometimes, and sometimes it is a legitimate sidestep. Sometimes it could qualify under a copyright exception called fair use, where you may not be taking enough to generate an infringement of copyright. So there are exceptions, but if you are using an entire textbook chapter or an entire journal article, depending on the purpose, very often it would be an infringement of copyright to not go through this procedure. So when you consider that a professor would have to do this for each work that he wants to hand out to his class, and would have to repeat that every time he wants to use a different work, or make a new permission, or make a different use of the work that he hasn't asked for permission for, it's quite a time-consuming, costly process. And in some cases, I consider some of the publishers' permissions request process is quite antiquated. They still insist, some still insist on faxing forms back and forth. They won't accept emails, or they don't have digital systems. So you have publishers that insist on 6 to 8 week processing periods sometimes, which is not conducive to a professor who has just seen this great article in the New York Times and wants to share it with his students. The cost, understandably, going through a very labor-intensive manual process like this does mean that the assembler who does have to do that work is going to charge for it. It's costly, and it's difficult or impossible for the professor to keep up-to-date materials flowing out to his students, knowing that it's all clean content.
Franny, do you have any practical sense of how often the official process is used versus the unofficial evade process is used?
Everything that goes through Kinko's is done that way, and everything that goes through the bookstore is done that way. So there are hundreds of course packs available through the bookstore, and probably as many through Kinko's. And Kinko's has gone portable, so it's very quick to be compliant.
Mm-hmm. Lots. So it's a high percentage.
Yes, I think it is a high percentage.
It's
well, I don't know high percentage, but there's a good deal. There's a good deal of illegal copying as well.
it depends on the school as well.
They put it through a copyright clearinghouse. They pay the exact fees.
I think the Stanford is pretty sensitive to this and do spend a lot of time educating their professors on copyright issues.
I get an email every year. I get an email every year from Mike Keller.
Yes. There are other schools, some of them currently under litigation from publishers that don't take the same type of precautions, and it really does depend on the type of use. I think some professors will photocopy and just give out handouts, but if they are creating an entire course reader, they will go through this painstaking process. So it depends on the type of use, it depends on the school, it depends on, like our coursework system right now, professors will, and this is the intranet system that professors use to distribute materials out to their students electronically on a website. They will post links up for their students, and that currently does not have a copyright clearance mechanism unless the professor is doing it themselves before they post the materials onto coursework. Which is, I think that would be a much lower percentage. Okay. So now that we have a sense of how the traditional copyright clearance process works, I wanted to contrast that against, this one. want to contrast that against the way we do things at Civics. So when we have a distribution platform that is connected with Civics, the general, the best way to describe this is to look at what we've done in the deployment. So we connected Civics through an API connection to a print-on-demand course reader distribution platform. And on this platform, a professor can go online to the website, create and assemble a course pack where they draw out different articles for their students. And each time they ask for a different article, the course reader distribution platform pings our API to ask, what is the copyright data on this? How much is it going to cost this user? And it also delivers a PDF of that article back so that it can be quickly assembled onto the distribution platform's website. Once the educator assembles the course reader, the students can go online, browse for their particular book, and make that purchase online and pick it up at the campus bookstore. So what we do on our end is we check for the registration of the work so that we can identify bibliographically what article it is that the professor wants. We do our license filtering process where we check to see whether or not there are pre-existing rights, and if not, what the payment price must be, and we communicate all of that back to the distribution platform with a copy of the article. So our objective here was we had done a lot of conceptual research, we had done a lot of planning, we had built the core technology to be used, and we felt that the next stage of our research was to advance this, to test the conceptual work and the newly built technology in an actual use environment. So Civics was connected and facilitated course readers for 3 Stanford courses. We've run a deployment spring 2011, and we ran a deployment this fall 2011. The class sizes varied from 10 students to 250 students, just to give us a variety, and they ranged in terms of department as well. So we had economics, we had psychology, we had physics, we had humanities courses. So what we observed during these deployments were quite interesting. There were many empirically calculatable, there was a lot of data we could calculate, but there was also a lot of observation on what the human experience was when professors and when students had this type of real-time copyright clarity. So we found that the professors updated their materials more often. In some cases, it was yearly to quarterly. And the anecdotal feedback we've had from professors has been that they do keep an eye out for, when they're reading now, for new articles that they could easily integrate into their next course. So it's changed the way that they started viewing the content they read, even if it's just generally. In some cases, we had a professor that actually hadn't updated her materials for several years, and for the first time using our system has been changing around her content. We found that there was increased use of materials, so there is a certain peace of mind that comes to professors when they know, I can use this, I'm not going to risk being sued by any publisher or the school getting sued by any publisher. And as an example of professor behavior in this regard, we had one professor who, upon discovering that our school subscriptions included Scientific American journals for her course readers at no additional copyright cost for students, ended up putting in 4 articles instead of her usual 1. So I felt a little bad that the students had to read extra. But I think this is, it's also a positive because it's giving students more access to content that has been selected through the professor's eyes for their benefit. We found that teachers and professors and students were interacting more in depth with content and even adding their own creative expression to the output. So civics architecture, particularly when combined with a print-on-demand system, does allow for personalization and customization. And it encouraged the professors to do things like ask us to implement cover art for their course readers. This is something they never cared about before in different deployments, but because it was so easy for them now to assemble things, and it was fun, it engaged them more, and they didn't want to put the extra effort in. We had professors looking at factors that they've never looked at before when deciding on content. Or they have, but it was at a very 6 to 8 week processing period type of situation. So in this case, they will look at factors such as, how much is this going to cost my student? Is this going to be difficult to clear? If it's not in the civics database and it has to be manually cleared, is it worth using this, or I have an equivalent article that I could use instead that could be free and cleared instantly? So instead of just looking at what the content of the article is, professors are now engaging more with the content to think of the cost concerns to their students as well. On the students' side, the print-on-demand platform that we connected with does allow the students to select which articles they can remove from the course reader. The professor will assemble the course reader and list all of the materials. They could list materials in there that are recommended readings that a student may not want to pay for. They could list materials in there that a student might already own a textbook for and don't want to pay the extra chapter pages and royalties for. So in this sense, the student will engage at an earlier stage with the materials to look at what's in the table of contents, whether or not they want that material. And in our most recent deployment, we did have one student making that engagement. It hasn't had a big uptake yet, but it's had some uptake. In terms of cost, I think it's pretty self-evident that when you automate a labor-intensive manual process, that there are obvious cost benefits that will result. So I won't go into too much detail on that, but I did want to give a small example, and that is because of civics technology, in our first deployment in spring 2011, we asked the professors to continue using their traditional distribution platform, whether that be the bookstore or an outside off-campus course reader assembly service. And we did a cost comparison based on their old system and the new civics system. So in terms of copyright costs, so these are what the bookstore under traditional, to explain an example of that, the economics reader was also sold at the Stanford bookstore, which used the traditional method of copyright clearance. The cost for copyright royalties alone in that course reader was $44.87, I think, out of a total of $80 course reader. Once civics filtered through its licensing filter process, the cost to the student became zero for copyright royalties. It depends on the materials that the professor chooses to put in. If it's not covered on the subscription license, then a student may not see the same savings, but there is a typically significant reduction when you filter this technology through. And for that, we had, so our dealings right now, and in our conversations with the bookstore, we have had reports from the bookstore that typically we expect about 85% of the enrolled students to actually buy a course reader. In our deployments, with the reduced prices and for a variety of other factors, I think we did a lot of promoting, saying part of a new technology and to participate in our pilot. We did have, I think, 100% participation. Every member of those classes purchased course readers. Yes.
I understand how this works for the reader, but go back to your example of the professor who wants an article from the New York Times. How would that scenario work out? Who does what when and what's it cost and who pays?
Under the current system,
No, under this.
under the civic system, the professor could go online. I can tell you right now that most New York Times articles are covered under Stanford subscription. So for the Stanford community, the royalty cost would be zero.
Well, let's pick one where there would be a cost.
If there is a cost, then say, it depends on how the professor is going to distribute this out. If they're going to make photocopies and put it into, and hand them out for the class, in that situation, we would have to have the professor paid under the current regime. But this is an interface that we can adjust as well. We haven't deployed for that particular use yet, so we will make adjustments as it goes through. I think our next deployment focuses on coursework. So I think the more likely scenario is what happens when a professor wants to put this onto coursework to have his students come and see the link and get it for themselves.
You might describe coursework.
Sure. Coursework is the intranet system used at Stanford, and it's a combination of a communication system as well as, I guess, like an e-reserves site where a professor can send messages to his students through it, or they can post up PDFs or post up links of different content he wants the professor, or he wants the student to read. So on this system right now, the copyright attention being paid is asking the professor to warrant that they have permission to put the materials they're putting online. And there's no actual, like the civics mechanism is not in there yet. So we're in discussions with coursework to figure out how this kind of implementation might work. And I think that would be better suited to your example about the New York Times, where it's just a one-off article. Some professors will just, like these days, most professors will just photocopy that article and bring it into their class. They can go through the traditional method of going to the copyright agency or copyright owner and purchasing, but then it would be on the professor to purchase for the entire class if he wants multiple copies. Eleanor and then.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how many people might be using JSTOR and other license databases, and also publishers Stanford pays such an enormous amount of money for license access to those journals. And the only thing that's confusing is what they call the rolling wall. So if it's from the last 5 years, then you have to go to the publisher. But if it's really older stuff, it's an awful lot of procedures. And I don't actually know many people who use tablets and a few people use courseware, lots of people just put things on the internet. But I guess my department just doesn't have long internet. There's still a big research shelf in the library. I mean, they're physical objects. In small departments, you can just go in and photocopy it and say, for study purposes. But I'm just wondering, I mean, whether how to make it all fit together, whether there is a universal model that works for everybody. Because I'm just wondering what the civics fees turn out to be for the students, whether any of that is already available. It obviously depends on the users. I mean, who knows? But have you looked at that interface between the already licensed articles?
Yes. So I think our most up-to-date connection is to go directly into the school system. So when we are checking, when we're doing the license filtering, we are actually checking against the subscription database that the school has. So it is as up-to-date as possible. It is as up-to-date as the library has access to. So that is a fairly confident connection. I mean, there will be copyright cases that civics cannot or should not be able to cover. Copyright is something that can be very customized, and Civics is obviously a system that benefits people who have many transactions, recurring transactions of the same type over and over. This type of micropayment system, any kind of a low-cost transaction that repeats very frequently, is best suited for a Civics type system. Negotiating a movie contract would be something that requires a lot more human language. So I think like my vision is at some point we may get there, but it's not something that we're dealing with right now, and we're still trying to figure out what the path to there would be.
Okay, thank you.
I read somewhere over 10 years ago that everything that had been published on the internet, every new document, literature, whatever you want to call it, that had been published on the internet since the inception of the internet, had surpassed everything ever written and meant by mankind preceding it. And I'm sure we're multiples over that now. How does this scale to something of that volume?
For everything on the internet. We have tried to create a system that is as simple as possible in terms of, because what it is at the base, the technology is not that hard. It's database, data ordering principles, certain workflows, but our technical and our research lead on the Civics project is Professor Michael Janetsworth at the Computer Science School, and he's designed this system to be as simple as possible to deal with exactly your question. How do we scale this when we're dealing with not 10 million or 100 million, but billions of different objects?
Your answer is then you would add terabytes.
Exactly. Yeah. There are certain techniques you can use. I mean, we try not to host. We try to be a conveyor of URL destinations. So the onus would go on the content owner to make sure their particular content is up to date and their URL destination is up to date, and that does help us in terms of server storage. We will, though, through the course of our research, we have realized that a lot of UGC and a lot of even smaller publishers don't have facilities to host for themselves and connect with a platform like this. So we do have facilities available through different partnerships where people can host if they want to. But there are different techniques that can be employed to help that scalability. So last slide, and this is what I'm most interested in for this discussion, but it's what I have the least amount of experience and expertise in. So I discuss this as an invitation for an exciting conversation. There are 3 questions listed here that I'll give some initial thoughts on, and then we can go back to the top and figure out what's most interesting to discuss. And these are issues that we've identified as the Civics research team as important areas to explore further. In the first question, when IP pricing creates this kind of transparency where say, a user finds 2 equivalent articles they can use, and it's so easy for them to find that magazine article A costs $5, magazine article B costs $7. What happens to the market? So will a more competitive marketplace result from this type of transparency that's available because of this new technology? Will it be there to push consumer costs down and empower the consumer, to make the content creators more innovative, to vie for consumer attention? Will there be resistance from market stakeholders? What kind of resistance would that come in? What form would that resistance come in? On the second question, do people need help and guidance in determining what the right price is for the content they create? So we're dealing with fantastic developments in technology that have given rise to a prolific user-generated content era. And these are not typically people like music labels or movie studios who have a lot of experience in pricing their own content out. And they could go on Amazon and see what someone else is making as selling as an equivalent price for their song. But given that the way culture views its society views its culture is somewhat subjective. Like how do you help people and guide them to setting the right price points, or should you help them and guide them to setting those right price points? And then coming back, the third question is coming back to the incentive, the incentive foundations of copyright. Will there be more works created and shared with society if mechanisms like civics are available? Will it be an incentive for more creativity, or will it just continue on the same pace regardless? People have inherent motivations for creativity. This is my touchy-feely question. So on that note, I think what I'm most interested in is the market question. And I'm just wondering, generally, does anyone have thoughts on that? Yes.
The business model really varies. It depends on what environment it's in. I see that you're a musician. And music publishing started as a way of composers being compensated for the fall off in sheet music. And so that's why it's called music publishing. And so there was a standard of what a piece of sheet music cost. And so that's how a recording, the music publishing and recording was marketed. And it's been since the 30s that way. In terms of now, if you look at the cost of music in terms of royalty, it varies. If it's a hard media such as CD, that goes to government regulation. They set the price, which is not our most efficient way. But if you look at the internet and the pricing of music on the internet, it's gone way down because the creators of the music have chosen to monetize in other forms, not directly from the IP itself. So that's one example. The market for IP pricing is based on what are its alternatives and what is the immediate value of it. So something that is very old but very valuable and not readily available is the formula for Coca-Cola. It cannot, and apparently after decades of attempts to reverse engineer it, it cannot be properly reverse engineered to duplicate the taste of Coca-Cola. So that is an example of very high-priced IP. So I don't know if I'm clarifying anything, but there are poles between a lot and nothing. And if it's a lot, the IP itself has a value. If it's nothing, there's some other form of alternative monetization, like Google. Google costs you nothing to go on, but they make their money on the advertising and the algorithm of getting in your head from the search that you do on Google.
I think I absolutely agree. Like there's such a range of different kinds of IP, but where you have the same type, so like an iTunes download of a song at 99 cents, where you have the same transaction, same general type of media and output. If you had a marketplace situation where iTunes is not in a position of dictating, well, it's got to be 99 cents or $1.29, these are the only options you have, where it is a free-form market, like eBay, where people can come in and set their own prices, what are we going to see on that? Will it be they'll just go with the regular standard iTunes prices, or will they start to adjust, say they see that there's enormous uptake in their particular product, they're going to swing that up 10 cents to try to capture as much value as possible. Or on the other hand, they see that there are lots of other songs out there that have hit top 40 and they're just going to keep the equivalent price at all of these other.
An equivalent model you may want to think of taking it out of the media aspect. is the model that has occurred with airline fares.
Yeah.
That is a more pure market situation that can apply to a lot of things.
I don't understand how they price airline.
Okay, so purely supply and demand. Number of seats to a given place at a given time.
Yeah.
You know, and they all go up when you get closer to the actual flight. So,
That's interesting.
yeah, that's how airline works. Pure supply and demand.
Cool. So, like, I'd be curious to see what would come, like, what model would develop it.
So, what do we know about what percentage of the payment goes to the creators and what percentage goes to the corporations?
Depends on your use.
Well, just, I mean, certainly the ones you're saying with course readers, it seems to me almost all the money that's exchanged there goes to corporations, not to the creators.
And so my short answer is there is no rule of thumb, but that said, here are some rules of thumb. In the publishing industry, I would say you see many contracts that have a publisher-author split of 50-50. So if I'm paying copyright royalties of $50 of my course reader, on my course reader, then 25 would be going to the publisher, 25 would be going to the author. And then in the music industry, they have a system where if you're signed to a music label, then typically as a performer, you would assign all of your copyright ownership to the music label. They fund you the money. It's like a venture capital fund. So they fund you the money for creating your CD, and the royalties that they earn go back to repaying that advance, and then once you hit your break-even point, then you get a certain cut. So there are many different ways that copyright royalties are split, depending on the industry practice.
Commercial book publishing, though, at the moment is imploding. And I belong to the Authors Guild, and they did a very detailed study a couple of months ago on how much authors are actually getting. And authors and publishers are being ground into the dust by e-books, because e-books have taken over the market. And I'm wondering whether they want to take over this market. You see, Apple has been completely inflexible. If you take Apple's 30% away from the cost of production, then the pie that authors and publishers split is much smaller than it used to be. And furthermore, the publishers feel they need to protect their interests so they can stay in business, so they're squeezing the authors into owning them things. And so this is driving a lot of authors just to go out on the internet and publish their own books. And so there's going to be possibly less control. Now that's a certain market. That's not exactly this market. But I think iTunes has been a great leveler. I mean, I remember people years ago saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to have micropayments and it's all going to be wonderful, and we'll get 3.5 cents for this and 5 cents for that, and everybody will be happy." But nobody reckoned on iTunes. So, and in composition, what a lot of people do is they just put things up for free. They're collaborative sites. Some of the music notation techniques can use. And as long as you're using their software, then you can put anything up there. You know, you have licensing agreements. It's a little bit like Creative Commons and specify what you can do. And loads of people. Because there's so little money to be made. And I think what this gentleman said was also right. Academic authors make, $10 a year. There are a few exceptions, but not many. It's not worth it.
I think more importantly, though, a registry system is necessary, even if you're not interested in the copyright royalties coming out of the market. It's like plugging the leak in the dam, right? At some point, we're going to have some sort of private system to start tracking and to create a centralized database of who owns what and where do you go to ask for permission to use stuff. The reason I say it's got to be a private system is because most governments have signed on to an international treaty that does not allow the government to impose this requirement as a law. otherwise that would be a really easy fix to the solution. And given the way international treaties work, this aspect of it is not really changing anytime soon.
There is some thought and actually some momentum underway in European countries, for example, that suggests that if it's easy to copyright works and to negotiate the transaction micropayments, that it will increase the creativity. In the creative sectors, it will increase productivity. And that will have a very positive impact on a national economy, for example. That's a lot of ifs and assumptions, but I think it's interesting to think about that in some sectors it might, where intellectual property is undervalued on the balance sheet because companies don't feel that they have a way to claim it and to do an easy transaction, that it could actually have an economic benefit to the country.
One thing that has been exhibited in the marketplace has been free content as a means of marketing. I think a good example of that was YouTube, where there was all sorts of illegal content or unclear content on it. And when the rights holders, primarily the movie companies, TV companies, music companies, said, we will want you to have our music videos and things like that, they said, okay, and they took it off, and the viral effect went away. They said, well, maybe we'll let you have some. And then there was a reaction to that being Hulu, which became a free site, which the main entertainment companies control. So, using an example in literature, in the future, a Harry Potter could be a 7-book series, but the first book may come out free.
To guide the sales for the next thing.
To create the awareness.
Yeah. It's also a great business model to do that. So great thought here.
I think that we should close soon. If there's another comment or a question, we can certainly take it before we close. And I know all the hands.
Yeah.
I'm curious if civics has already encountered the problem of politics, oppositions from corporations already in a like business, where they view it as public versus private competition, and unfair. So they say.
There's definitely competitors in the same space. And when I say competitors, I mean, like we are exploring a research theme. That's our goal here. But say working the cost comparison we did in the spring deployment, where we compared ours with bookstore. Now, all of our pilot professors no longer use the bookstore. So those kinds of situations will occur where there is some politics to be played out. There are copyright agencies that we want to work with, could potentially see us as overlapping. So those types of politics do have to be played very delicately as well. I think in general, though, people see there's a need to improve the current system. Right? To keep going status quo makes no sense. And this has been, the reaction we've had is this has been a refreshing change to what a lot of people are seeing. It's been slightly disruptive. It's had great uptake and great feedback from users, and we do get requests for more and more courses to join on. So we have politics, but I think we're handling everything in the right way.
Well, thank you. Join with me, please, and thank you.